Hello, everyone. Greetings from the Columbia University Center for Palestine Studies in New York City. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here today. Today's event is entitled Parallax Haifa, and it's a part of our ongoing collaborative relationship with our wonderful colleagues Amira Assad and Leila Piñado at Lifta Volumes. Today we're going to hear some discussion on the project Parallax Haifa, and we're going to begin by watching, I think, about 20 minutes of a multimedia presentation, followed by discussion by our two colleagues who I'll now introduce. It's a great pleasure to have Lama Suleiman and Nadine Fattaleh here with us today. Lama is a writer, researcher, cultural critic, and artistic producer based in Haifa, Palestine. Lama has obtained a bachelor's degree from City University London in sociology and media studies in 2013, and a master's degree in critical sociology from Ben Gurion University 2020, both with high distinction. Congratulations, Lama. As a researcher, Lama specializes in Arab modern history of the Middle East, specifically in studying the phenomenology of everyday life in urban landscapes in pre-Nakba Palestine. Since 2017, she's been developing a vast historical and archival research that she has recently begun to expand into screenwriting. Lama is a published writer and cultural critic. Her most notable publications deal with the concept of Arab futurism and contemporary Arab cultural development, policy, and activism. In addition, Lama has also had experience in art curation, working on numerous exhibitions dealing with life in the public realm, the digital realm, and the realm of dreams. Welcome, Lama. Nadine Fattaleh. Nadine is a Palestinian writer and researcher from Amman. Her work focuses on spatial practices through cartography and film. She previously worked on projects at the Center for Spatial Research, Studio X Amman, and the MMAG Foundation Amman. She's currently the Osun Fellow in Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College. Nadine received her BA in Middle East, South Asian and African Studies from Columbia University, and an MS in Critical, Curatorial and Conceptual Practices in Architecture at Columbia GSAP. So welcome, Nadine. I'm now going to hand you over to Lama, who will say a few words about the project, and then we'll watch the media presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian and Nadine, and for CPS for hosting us, and Lifta, of course. I thank you also for joining us in this conversation. I hope we can, it's not a very equal kind of conversation. We can all see and hear each other, but I'm hoping it's going to be fun. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here myself. And a bit about the project, but first also a technical note, because my connection is a little bit unstable, so sometimes the audio disappears, so excuse me if that kind of hinders the communication. And yeah, so we're gonna be screening the first episode of the project of Parallax Haifa, so you'll be able, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, it is available online, and also the second episode. So yeah, we'll be seeing it now together. And we can discuss the project, I guess, more at length and hear your thoughts. Yeah. Nadine, anything you'd like to say?
It's super exciting to be here. The project I saw in the first version as a written text, and now it's a multimedia presentation. It's absolutely fabulous. Just a note that you can watch and follow on the screen here, or I believe someone will drop a link to the presentation if you prefer to watch it at your own pace, or if for some reason your internet is lagging. But I think otherwise we can go ahead.
Sheikh Ibrahim was a crude man with a temper, from the nearby village of Ibton. He was a proud man accustomed to the traditional life of the village, and has worked the land all his life growing grains. He valued the ways of the simple life. and believed in plowing what he sowed. But the times were changing, and the uncertainties of life were weighing down on Ibrahim, threatening the traditional life he valued so much. Sheikh Ibrahim was angered by the new tractors some of the landowners were buying. He hated the asphalt roads, the speeding pace of the automobiles, their noise, and the crowdedness of the industrial life of the cities. He was especially disgruntled, though, by the new youth movement's petition to the government to open a girls' school in the village. It is the decadence of the nation, a death of men's honor. Girls to learn to read, you won't be able to keep up with all the romance and the love letters from now on. But the school was established in spite of his heated objections. Every morning, Sheikh Ibrahim would glower as he watched the village girls walk to school. He had such contempt, as if the girls were personally insulting him with such a deliberate act of provocation. Thus, his only satisfaction was forbidding his own daughter to attend the school, despite her mother's repeated attempts to get his approval. Listen to me, Ya Amin. No daughter of mine goes to school. I shall kill her if she even sets foot on that school's threshold. But Sheikh Ibrahim could not hold against the evils of such cultural degradation for very long. With the economic crisis hitting Akka, the Sheikh was forced to sell his wheat produce in Haifa instead. His beloved Akka, with its great ancient walls and camel caravans loaded with golden grains of wheat, lining the coast of the city of Al-Jazzar, and its market, which bustled with the shouts of the merchants and the chatter of his fellow peasants. The sight of the sea used to captivate him, but now it seems to pull him violently away from the sheltering mountain of his village. He looked back at Akka with indignant pride, as opposed to his repulsion from the estranged and unfamiliar landscape that rushed past the window of the bus he now took to Haifa. A tolling sound of clanking metal startles Sheikh Ibrahim out of his mournful reverie. "What's wrong with you, old man? Can't you hear? Hand me your ticket," a skinny brown-faced ticket inspector says impatiently. "What makes you think you can shout like this in my face? Do you think everybody are servants to the likes of you? We are busy, old man. Or do you think we are sitting around picking olives all day? Now give me your ticket." The young man snaps back as he snatches the paper ticket from Ibrahim's hand, pricks it with a hole with his paper fiskars, and moves down the bus apathetically. "Amma zamanu, amma sa'ada. What a time. Such excellency," Sheikh Ibrahim grumbles bitterly. As the bus approaches Haifa, Ibrahim watches the enormous petrol tanks, like titans, towering over the surrounding plains, and behind them the city rises out as a jumble of overcrowded houses, one on top of the other. From his right, Ibrahim could hear the daunting whistle of the passing train, with its carriages loaded with black coal speeding onto the metal tracks, while to his left he was greeted by dug-up tunnels in the ground and the grey factories of cement and tin, completely banishing Akka, its fort, and its sea from his thoughts. The bus pulls up opposite Haifa's railway station and discharges Sheikh Ibrahim and his haul of wheat onto the street to make his way to the grain market up ahead by the clock tower of Al-Nasr Mosque. The street was an axis, fixing objects and people along a horizontal line of movement. Army vehicles, buses, and trucks loaded with heavy metal roads towed in and out of the city, leaving behind a cacophony of thundering engine sounds. Elegantly dressed men drove smaller automobiles, with powdered women sitting next to them, many of them covering their eyes with black eyepieces. This was the city's eastern gate. It stretched from the Hijaz railway station through the main road of Faisal Street, Iraq Street, and towards the outer fringe of Wadi Salib neighborhood. The sound of the train from Al-Qantara filled the air with its chugging and whistling as it approaches the station. While some were waiting for the train, others are queuing up on the side of the road to take the bus service to Beirut. Inside the station, crowds of people and luggage were alighting from the train and onto the platform as others rushed towards it wildly, as if they had suddenly lost their minds. For those continuing their journey further north to Damascus, the view of Haifa Sea extended the temptation of an unfulfilled visit. As Sheikh Ibrahim slowly disappears up the street between the crowds, 3 young men arrive in Haifa by train. With difficulty, they managed to make their way out of the station onto the main road. They passed through a large square with automobiles driving around it, in the middle of which stands the marble column of King Faisal I, with its broken capital commemorating the fight for Arab unity and mourning its death. From Faisal Square, the roads fork out into the interior of Haifa. The area was the center of economic life of the city and the nearby region. Around the eastern gate were shops and stock rooms used to store various grains that arrive by the railway from the Huran region, and produce that is sent to European and Mediterranean countries through Haifa's port. The eastern gate was known as the merchant market. Merchants from all across the nation, as well as from Syrian, Lebanese, and Egyptian cities, moved to the city and took their spots on the edges of the square and inside the nearby marketplace. When we were still in our early 20s, we would go on some Sundays, me and my two friends, Adib Atqi and Shafiq Darwish, to watch a film in one of the cinemas in Haifa. Afterwards, we would go to eat at Prost restaurant in the German colony, where we would be treated to a light dinner and a few glasses of beer. Then we would make our journey back to Akka, which was at a close distance from Haifa. The road between the two cities ran all along the beach, on a sandy, unpaved road. There were plenty of cars. Sometimes, if the winds were high, the strong waves would splash the passengers with cold water. While some people would laugh about it, others got angry and foul-mouthed, depending on the day. Up ahead, just after Faisal Square, Souk al-Shwam was one of the markets forking out towards Al-Jraini Market. Its shops specialized in selling Levantine fabrics. Souk al-Shwam is made up of a long archway consisting of two branches, the first leading to Hamambasha, and the second stretching towards Istiqlal Square beside the mosque. The most famous shops in this market were Khalil Kamil Watfis Perfumery, Namro's Sweets Shop, Al-Awa Textile Shop, Shafiq Bajjali's Wholesale Fabric Shop, and Sharif Abu Eid's Manufactory Shop. I make a turn between two shops and take a detour to Souk al-Shwam. It's much more relaxed, with its darkened arched pathways and lavish shops, neatly stocked with all kinds of extraordinary merchandise. It's my favorite part of the market. Sometimes, I spend hours feeling the soft fabrics brought from the Levant. I'm especially in love with Abu Yahya's shop, with beautiful Damascene ornamented wood, carpets, curtains, and his proud collection of copper cauldrons. At the other end of Souk al-Shwam, I am back under the open sky and passing by Hamambasha, the city's public bath. I remember when my grandmother took me with her on one of her regular visits to the hammam. That day, when I entered the bath, I was fascinated by my surroundings. I liked the vast outer hall. It had a pool brimming with flowing water. Narrow benches against the walls were covered with colored rugs, on which were thrown the clothes of the bathing women. The walls themselves were adorned with old yellow pocked mirrors, and with plaques engraved with wisdom sayings, several of which made it clear that cleanliness is godliness. Suddenly, out of the dark, a shriveled gray-haired, middle-aged woman hurried towards us. She had a face on which misery had dug deep furrows, and was naked except for a discolored cloth that dangled from her waist down to her knees. She welcomed us with a twangy voice, chattering words I did not understand, because of the din of splashing and voices, the hot steam that veiled my vision, and the nauseating smell of sweat and steam, all of which made me dizzy. For a moment, I thought I was going to throw up, and leaned on the servant. It took a few seconds for my head to clear as I got used to it all. I was also better able to peer through the darkness by now. We soon arrived in a small hall with a large circular pool in the middle, around which several women sat, chattering and bathing themselves. "Why don't we join them?" I asked my grandmother. "This is the middle hall," she said. "I have reserved a chamber in the inner hall. I'm not used to bathing with the rabble." I followed her, and we entered through a small door to the inner hall. I stared around in wonder. In each corner of the square hall, there was a large white marble basin where women sat, completely involved in massaging, sponging, and washing themselves, in constant movement, as though in a race. From glass-covered round openings in a high dome, the sun rays flooded in, to light up the entire hall. The din here reached its climax. The tingling of bowls, the splashing of water, the screams of children, and the voices of the women that were getting louder so as to make themselves heard. My grandmother stopped to greet a friend of hers, while I watched a violent quarrel between two young women. Both were married to the same man and had just met for the first time. The quarrel became heated and led to their throwing their bowls at each other. Gallantry took hold of some of the other bathers, and they separated the two wives before they could hurt each other. I stood at the door of the chamber, amusing myself by watching the others. Young women went in and out of the outer hall for recreation. Proud of their youth and of their colorful mazars, embroidered with gold thread, they swayed as they walked, like Indian women in an incense-filled temple. Little circles of light fell from the ceiling and danced on their lithe bodies, accentuating their luster. But it saddened me to see the old women sitting next to the walls, chatting with each other, while the henna paste on their heads melted and ran in black trickles down the furrows on their foreheads and cheeks. They waited patiently for some attendant to come and wash it away. Not far, on the bench nearest the wall of the furnace, another secluded group attracted my attention. In the midst was a young woman, about 16, looking bored and discontented, as if enervated by the heat emanating from the place near where she sat. She was surrounded by 3 women, one in particular fussing over her, most likely her mother. She soon began rubbing the young woman's body with shaddad, a yellow paste smelling of ginger, which my grandmother told me it strengthened the veins of a woman after childbirth and made them stronger than before. The group of women were talking and laughing loudly. It seemed they were amused by some gossip about a woman they know, a regular customer at the bath. She was known for badgering her husband incessantly, demanding he buy her earrings, jewels, and other expensive gifts so she could show them off to her neighbors. One day, weary of his wife's demands, the husband decided to trick her, hoping to forever rid himself of her annoying existence. He sent her to look for a gift he had supposedly left her in the house next door, a large 3-story house that has been empty for years and was suspected by people in the neighborhood to be haunted by the jinn. There, while she was admiring the lavishness of the house, its marbles, dusty wooden furniture, and crystal chandeliers, she was met by no other than the demon Margarouche. Margarouche was small in size. In fact, the women describe him as being the length of the male genitals. He had a tall face, his eyes long and unrounded, and wore a genie hat embroidered with mysterious hieroglyphs of a strange language and adorned with the seal of Solomon. As for his arms and legs, they were bursting with muscles, with thick protruding veins in which blue blood flowed. He was frightening, especially when he moved his head rapidly from left to right, letting his thick lips hang loose, sticking out his long and pointed tongue to make a terrifying sound, and gesturing with his 3-fingered hands. Stories of the jinn were a source of much horror for the people in the town. It was as if their only concern was to avoid the harms and evils of the jinn, that they used to cover their mirrors at night in fear of the appearance of demons in their reflections. They steered away from black cats, never left their scissors open for fear of Margarouche using them, and they put their faith in incantations and fortune-telling. As rumors suggest, years later, Margarouche was finally outmaneuvered by the people of the town. He was cast into the sea and buried deep in the waters at the Sikali beach to prevent him from ever returning to haunt them. After we finished sponging and scrubbing, we exited the bath, passing by Victoria Hotel, Haifa's hub of cabaret, traditional folk dancing, and the singing of Al-Awalim. From the hotel, which was just next to Haifa's Ottoman government building, Saraya, we proceed to Souq al-Abyad, just beyond El Jraini Square and the Great Mosque, with shops spread out all around it. Souq al-Abyad is Haifa's main market, always bustling with people, merchants, livestock, Indian date sellers, trolleys, carousel carriages, and other modes of transport. With its roofed narrow alleys, Souk al-Abyad was as usual whirling with the noise of people wedging their way through the paths of others, the calls of the merchants, the muddled conversations of shoppers and passers-by, and the lowing of the livestock. I pass Abu Salah al-Akkawi's store selling phonographs and records, and stop next door at the printing press of المطبعة التجارية الأهلية, where my friend Sheikh Ibrahim works. I always enjoyed my visits to Nuh. Aside from being a man of good conversation with an exquisite sense of humor, Nuh was well known in Haifa as the poet of the Palestinian Revolution. He was persecuted and imprisoned by the British on numerous occasions and had spent a long time inside Akka's prison, where he wrote some of his best songs and poems. His song, Allah يخزي هالشيطان, was particularly popular in Palestine and has even competed with vinyl sales of Abd al-Wahab and Kulthum. When he performed in the cafes of the city, Nuh entered the stage as a poet for the common person, the school children, and the often illiterate farmer and worker. At the end of the market, we exit at Khamra Square, Sahet al-Hanatir, where the carriages are lined with their beautiful stallions, tilting their shiny napes and brushing their tails, each according to their own rhythm, depending on the circulation of flies swarming in their midst. There is a unique whiff to the city when the carriages are running in its arteries, the galloping of hooves on the asphalt, the squeaking of the wooden wheels and metal frames, the clucking of the coachman ushering the horses and cursing those that would not get out of his way, and the lashing of his whip as it hits the ground beneath the horses. Annasri. This was how the words were uttered by the man standing at Sahet al-Hanatir, on the right edge of the east corner, beside Al-Khatib Street and Al-Abd restaurant. It is the man wearing a fringy grey cap on his head. His job is to round up people traveling to Nazareth and take them to the Duzuto taxi cars. His voice was very thick, like the sound of al-Jarushi. When he shouted, the veins stuck out of his neck as if they were about to explode, his open mouth revealing his yellow teeth. In the heart of the city, on Jaffa Road, near Khamra Square, the voices of the newspaper vendors of Palestine with Difa announced their exciting headlines and news of riots, arrests, ambushes, and victims. Like all other newspaper sellers, Yusuf battled the long hours of the day with his best methods of persuasion and temptation, to rid himself of his heavy batch of printed paper. Yusuf began his shift early every morning with a seemingly endless mountain of newspapers that became lighter as the hours passed and he roamed the city streets and squares. Aside from his few regular readers, who were used to buying the daily paper from him, Yusuf's best chance to finish his pile was to get to the bus station before the other sellers do. Whenever a bus would approach, the newspaper sellers would all race to get to the alighting passengers, shouting out their best headlines and most exciting news, hoping someone might find them to be of interest. While on some days Yusuf would emerge triumphant from the battle of the newspaper sellers, today was one of those days when the hurried crowds of people seemed like a kind of momentary mirage that has beamed in for a moment or two, only to disappear quickly as they scurried along their paths unavailingly, leaving Yusuf fruitless in his mundane daily pursuit. As for his own story, it was comparable to the daily news that he tends to announce: a life of poverty, wretchedness, and purposelessness, a constant struggle to earn his meal of the day, which was always bland and detestable in taste. But despite this misery, Yusuf still enjoyed laughter and pleasure. He especially enjoyed spending time at the cinema. He often told his friends about the excellent films he has seen. He had a special appreciation for adventure films about smart criminals outwitting the police, or cowboys and horses racing the wind, clapping with excitement in tribute to the hero. These scenic images of wide stretching valleys and thick grass captured his imagination and made him forget about the dirty front row seats of the humble theater. They were scenes that allowed him to retreat from the hardships of his simple life and provided him with the material to recount with his friends the next day.
Thank you so much, Lama. Very lovely to see this for the third or the fourth time. And can't wait to watch the next episodes. So I think I'll start with a little bit of a response, which is just my letter of awe and appreciation to the work that you've done and the ways that it inspires me in my own work. So there's a surface level interpretation to what we just saw. Your layered maps of local monuments overlaid with photographs and moving images of the landscape and its people can be crucial for our narrative. As historical documents, these images authenticate Palestinian presence there, in the place deemed a land without a people for a people without a land. But I think we can also move past these shallow parochialisms, because your work, our work, does much more than simply dispel alibis of imperial conquest. As Palestinians, our photographic and audiovisual archive is marred by the complexity of the gaze that produces and safeguards images of our past. You compile a litany of images that register different vibrations of fragmentary heritage. We find you using photographs of the Orientalist tradition of imaging the Holy Land and figuring Palestinian subjects as the living cast of the Bible. Elsewhere, we see moving footage documenting the landscape from the Australian War Memorial, captured for the strategic purposes on the eve of the, I believe, First World War, could be wrong. Finally, the most generous archival source is of the earliest Palestinian photographers like Kerkoukian or Rad, whose portraits transport us to the aspirational character of the urban nobility in the early 20th century. And they differ from the colonial gaze, not formally, but perhaps only by way of the identity of the person behind the camera. Those with a trained eye might smirk as they spot your metaphorical slippages, where photographs of a cabaret in Damascus stand in for the absent visual scenes of nightlife in Haifa. Your practice can be likened to what Tina Camp calls listening to images, quote, a method of calibrating vernacular photographs as quiet, quotidian practices that give us access to the affective registers through which these images enunciate alternative accounts of their subjects. Out of the silencing shutter of the camera emerges shudders and shouts of the market, with its peddlers, hustlers, and businessmen, alongside more faint reverberations of whispered gossip from the woman's bath. Unlike a film that demands an image to populate its every frame, your interactive sound text image montage indexes the absence of several visual registers. From the gap or the empty slate comes a troubling of the tyranny of the visual. And you assert that history does actually exist outside of the photographed event, just as notions of truth for the people of the time reverberate around the unseen and the fleeting, perhaps exemplified by the belief of the Jinn Margarouche. The juxtaposition you produce through montage of multitudinous references and citations has stark effects. The tableau of characters testifies to the unruly heterogeneity of Palestinians, from vegetable sellers to folk poets and everything in between, all joined by their cohabitation of one space, Haifa at the onslaught of modernity. At some point in the story, the narrator invokes the spatial organization of the city along a street that was, in your words, an axis, fixing people along a horizontal line of movement. Against the official, planned, and readable city represented in the geometric lines of your map, the texture of the text is anything but horizontal, composed of drifts, ellipses, and alterations that move us through quotidian acts and chance pedestrian encounters. The urban experience of the city comes alive in its noises, smells, tastes, striving not to construct what was there, but more crucially, to imagine what it must have felt like to be there. Atop the ordered space of Haifa, you produce a poetic geography of the everyday that belies a disquieting familiarity with the place and knowledge of it as both historian and dreamer. So maybe I'll start with the first question. Can Can you talk a bit about the genesis of the project and how it started out as a project of a capital H history and later became a sort of critical fabulation from the archive that we saw today?
Well, first, thank you for that. It was beautiful. Yeah, I think I'm also going to be kind of answering the question that just came out in the Q&A about the historical political context, so it's going to go in. But firstly, I started this project, I think about 3 to 4 years ago, and it kind of developed in a strange way, but it kept building up. And it's actually been in development ever since. It was started as a master's project, and even after I submitted it, it continued to develop. And to be honest, until this day, I don't think it will ever finish because there's always a way to kind of view it differently. But it started as a historical research in which I wanted to kind of, I'm based in Haifa, so the landscape here is very telling of the absence in it is very felt in everyday life. And the presence of an untold history is always like played out whenever you walk in the city. So you're always wondering what it actually was like. And it started out as a historical project in the sense that I just wanted to know the history of the city, how it looked like, what it was before, and it led me into a very kind of traditional historical research in which I'm reading materials about the structural buildup of the city, about the colonial influences, about the Ottoman influences, about the influences of the war, that kind of a scenario of the way in which history is written. And all the while I was fascinated with the archive because I felt that if I could find images or all kinds of other documents and materials in the archive, then maybe I would be able to fill in the gaps that, tell what the city was like, that this history does not. But I was disappointed all the time by the archive because the same kind of absence is very much marked there as well. The images that you see here, very few of them are actually from Haifa. I think I also wasn't very hung up on finding actual exact information or visual information of Haifa. I think I collated Haifa with many other Palestinian and Levantine cities during the time. So it wasn't important for me to find, exact factual information. But still, it was still very much absent. The archive seemed to only photograph the landscape through a colonial, imperial, and very biblical gaze. Most of the everyday visual material was very much biblical. The colonial material I was actually less interested in because I wanted to capture this landscape in a time in which the colonial did not exist. I know this period of time, no one can say that it actually happened. It's completely imaginary period of time. But I wanted to kind of erase the coloniality of the archive and just like look at the footage and the images that tell the everyday, even though you can't separate the two from each other. Regarding the political context, I think the issue of the rise of Arab modernity is exactly the time frame that I'm looking at. I think it's because it says a lot about what also we're doing now in terms of kind of the ways in which we produce the Palestinian city today is detached from the ways that the Palestinian city has been produced in the past. And I thought that going back to this time period can be essential for our knowledge today and kind of reinventing itself, not really reinventing itself, but kind of becoming more connected to the issues that defined cities in the past, and to kind of create a continuity despite of the rupture of the Nakba between the past and the present. Sorry. So yeah, I think that may answer your question.
Yeah. Shall we take the question from Frial Khalifa, who's asking, what archive did you use? A little more on this, please. And I think maybe if I'm allowed to just add one more question, if you can expand on some of the literary archives that you drew upon, and some of perhaps the problems of the gender of the archive and the position from which you appropriate these documents.
Yeah, so the archives that I used are mostly Israeli archives and some Palestinian archives that are available digitally and online, but not all because of access issues. And some also digitalized colonial archives that are mostly Library of Congress, which is the biggest archive so far. Regarding the video archives, also it was only the archives that I used were only those that were available online. So I would imagine that the accessibility of the archives is very much like the selection of materials that went into these collages is very much indicative of the problem of accessibility. But also the problem of not ever knowing what is the Palestinian archive really, and the extent of which it exists, if it can be accessed at all. And there's always the feeling of, if you're finding this image and then you're excited, and then you're finding that image and then you're excited, and then kind of the excitement fades because you know that there's so many more that you will never find because you don't know if they actually exist. So there's always this really strange kind of philosophical trap whenever you're looking at archives. But mostly if you go into the website format, which is actually the better way to view the collages, because you can pause, you can actually zoom into the map, and almost at every window there's an eye icon that you can click, and then you can see the source of the photograph or the video. So you can kind of trace things. But yeah. There was another question that I missed, I think, Nadine.
Wasim Rantus is asking, is there Arabic narration translation?
Yeah. Actually about half of the narratives were translated from Arabic, and the other half were found already translated by, some of them actually appear in the book by Salma Jayousi, in which she brought a lot of really beautiful stories, and several translators have worked to translate them. So unfortunately, I haven't gone around to actually producing the same work in Arabic, because I do feel it needs to be in the original language. But I guess that's something that can happen. It's always a thought.
More of a comment. Rose is saying, marvelous work, impressive research. Thank you for sharing. Maysay Ali is saying, I wrote the history of Haifa during the early century you are depicting. I'm a classical historian, and your work is beautiful to fill in the gaps. I appreciate your attempt to fill this human perspective of Haifa, my city where I never lived. However, there has been some work on other dimensions of the society of Haifa in the 30s and 40s, especially about the middle classes. Maybe in relation to this, I'll kind of intervene to ask, like, where you think your knowledge and understanding and experience of Haifa today clashes with this project. Do you feel like your understanding of the space helps you to narrate the historical material in particular ways, etc.? So something so profoundly spatial about the narrative. You must know this.
Well, thank you, May, for your comment, and also for your work, because actually the research that I've done builds greatly on the book that you've written about Haifa. So it's really lovely collaboration, how it works. Yeah, I think a lot of, I do have a lot of critique to the way that the narratives are structured. Also, to be honest, like the fact that I was able to find the historical aspects that I was looking for only in fiction is very telling of the limits of history, really. But also, I think that fiction in itself is always told, you know, there's a colonial gaze and there's the bourgeois gaze of the bourgeois photographers. And there's also the bourgeois male gaze of Palestinian and Arabic fiction. I think very few of the narratives that were collaged here were written by women, unfortunately. In some cases, I think I also replaced male characters with female characters to, you know, just to have that sensitivity, but it's not, it's very minimal kind of act to do. I think also episode 3, which has been written, but I decided not to record it yet, is always a problem for me because I feel like these narratives and the way that they've been collaged are only one way of doing it, and they're only from a very specific selection of materials from which you can build it. So episode 3 is always problematic, and I never know how to end it. And then a few months back, when I think the third intifada, so-called, started to happen, I was really reluctant to record episode 3 because it just like couldn't make sense anymore. It's like I couldn't end it with a bourgeois story. You know, the reality demands something a bit more sensitive. And then, you know, the ending of episode 3 keeps changing all the time. So, so yeah, I think what I've been trying to do, and I think what a lot of people have been trying to do, because I keep talking to people, having conversations about people who are working in various fields, and somehow we end up all working on kind of the same question, but in different ways. So I think the idea of manipulating the archive as a kind of like, it's kind of a, I don't want to call it an act of resistance because it's not, but I think it's a way to kind of subvert and deconstruct the effects of the archive on our inability to write our own history. So I think this was mostly an exercise and a practice that in itself can translate into something much more. But also that's why I'm kind of really enjoying having this conversation, but also because I know Nadine is working on things that really do complement each other. And I think that we all work on things that complement each other. So these are things that I would like to kind of discuss further at some point. And yeah.
Shall we try to ask May if she wants to unmute? Okay.
Hello. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for very interesting perspective of a place I know also virtually.
Mm-hmm.
I am from Haifa, and I have strong attachment to something that I've never lived, because I came back afterwards, and your perspective is on another side. You need to go to the diasporic Haifaites. And there was very recently a study on the middle class, which is another perspective. It's not the whole story. Yours is very important. I've attended every single corner you've put in. I've walked all these. And when I started my work, the most interesting aspect, which was really in the early 70s, is that I went through Haifa with 10 old people, old men from Haifa, who walked with me the streets you have shown. Mm-hmm. I think what you need is a perspective of such people, because who stayed in Haifa, you have to recognize, are mostly not originally from Haifa. Most of the original population of Haifa emigrated, maybe 1/3 or less was left. And these are very important nucleus to know Haifa during the early period. I loved what you produced. I loved hearing about Hamambasha, about your grandmother and El-Jinn and all stories, but I also would have wanted the historical, political aspect of that era, of that very early period, which we miss. I tried to produce this in some writings, such as the book by Maria Elisa Rogers, which viewed the era you are looking at, but from the community, the inside, the people she used to see. This is a lovely story. Thank you very much. I appreciate what you're doing, and I wish you the best of luck. You are the new generation, and I give up to all of you the new wave of putting things in such a dynamic and more than one formulation to tell the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maisakali, because your work is, I think, monumental in telling the history of Haifa. And I would love to continue this conversation with you actually about the issue of the context and about talking with people who are from Haifa. So I would love to ask you more about that. Yeah.
We'll take, oh wow, there's a ton of questions. So we'll do it by order. Gala is saying, I'd like to know more about your methodology and how it connects to the notion of Arab futurism.
So yeah, methodology has been, it started as history. I was fascinated with the history and its methodologies, but at some point, I don't know, it kind of just happened on its own. The more, I think what's fascinating about academia, at least, if anything, is the fact that there's so many limitations of the way that it is structured. It is a very colonial kind of institution that has kept a lot of the structures of producing research in which we operate today. And I think it's quite fascinating to spot all of those limitations and then to say, I don't care, I'm just going to do this and not care. It's kind of nice. And then it's actually really nice to write to justify the methodologies that you've chosen, because, yeah, I don't know, it's just really fun. It doesn't mean anything. And what you've done doesn't mean anything to them, and what they've done don't mean anything to you. So you kind of just agree to disagree. It's quite nice. Just to be more specific, sorry, Gala. Methodologies, usually narrative research, really, a lot of archival research. And I built on a concept that is called narrative collage, which is collaging narratives, which I kind of transplanted into a map. So I tried to do a narrative collage through constructing it on a map of actual real places, through information that I found historically, through archives, facts, and also some autobiographical fiction about Haifa.
Okay, we'll continue. I'll do like 2 at a time because this is hugely popular. So Karim is saying, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask, how do you think about your project in relation to Palestinian conceptions and practices of return? Kanafani's return to Haifa is, of course, both a spatial and a temporal return back to Haifa, back to 48. In your project, I'm struck by the personal present tense narration, and I think about young 48 Palestinians taking trips to destroyed villages, have emphasized reactivating buildings and community in the present, maybe a departure from the more nostalgic gaze of previous generations. Could you talk about how you're thinking temporally about return here? And then maybe we'll take Mahdi Sabah's question. Thank you for sharing. Could you talk about the importance of rendering archives on Palestine, many of which are locked up in Israeli institutions, accessible to Palestinians?
Okay, so I'll start with the question about return and futurism. I am originally from Nazareth, so I'm not Haifa born. I don't think anyone really is originally from Haifa anymore. And I think that plays a factor in your question, because it's really difficult to imagine return in this kind of scenario and setting. I think in contemporary times, a lot of Palestinians are choosing Haifa as their city. I think a lot of people, I do not know, I don't know where you are from, Karim, where you're based, and if you've been into Haifa. But I think a lot of people have been kind of living in the city for a few years, and I personally, myself, and I know a lot of people who regard Haifa to be a completely Palestinian city. So when I encounter Israelis outside of the borders of the city, the inner city to which I am used, I'm always kind of confronted by this reality that I know exists, obviously, but it's always as if being in this kind of Palestinian city always kind of creates distance from the colonial apparatus. So I think in terms of return, I think this sentiment, or this kind of, maybe it's a fantasy in our heads, but I think it's already playing a part in our visions of return. But I think that those visions are very much shaped by the fact that the past has been stolen from us. So I think our visualization of the future is still very much stuck in the past. And I think that's why I also became kind of engrossed in this project for that long, because it's a way to go back to something that has been lost and stolen, completely demolished and erased from the landscape, and to kind of start from there. I think the concept of return, a question of return really, in terms of as a philosophical question, is something that always accompanies us. And I think that I personally, I don't know how you feel about it, but I feel like it's always something so difficult to imagine. It always feels like there's something else missing first, so that you can start even trying to visualize it. So I guess this was my attempt. I would like to hear about yours also. And regarding Maddie's question, sorry. Yeah, rendering archives on Palestine. I can't say I'm an archive expert, not at all. I think I'm kind of also intimidated by the vast extent of the archive. But I think there's a lot of interesting projects that are happening in Palestine and outside that have to do with digitalization. One of which is the Palestinian Museums Archive. So I think already a lot of attempts are happening in terms of making Palestinian archives accessible. I think also I encountered this a few times during my online searches. I think the American University in Beirut has a lot of information that could be really monumental for us, but which has not yet been accessed or made available to people remotely. So I think that would be an interesting place to also look for. And also I think Ottoman archives would be amazing to look into, although they would contain much less visual material. But yeah.
Okay, we'll just continue. Amanda Batarse, the story, I'm wondering sources you accessed for those. Were they received by you through family, friends, orally, or written archives? If I'm allowed to put my 2 cents, you can consult the writings of Dr. Tawfiq Kanaan on this one. And then Lina is asking, do you know about any collective project to gather and make accessible existing photo and video archives of Haifa and the Galilee, sorry?
Okay, so regarding Amanda's question about the story of Margarosh, I think it was written by Majid Al-Khamra, his name is, and he collected the story from, it was oral history kind of collection of stories from a Palestinian artist who is called Abd Abdi, who is Haifa based. And I don't know if he's originally from Haifa. I would imagine that he is. I don't have the knowledge, but yeah. And his book, if you would like me to refer you to it, is published online that you can access and read. It's in Arabic, but it's very interesting and contains a lot of oral history, collected stories about Haifa. And yeah, to hi Lina. But Lina's question about gathering and making accessible the existing Palestinian photo and video archives of Haifa and the Galilee. So I do not know of such a endeavor at the moment. I know there's a few people locally in the Galilee who have been collecting photographs from families and publishing them and making them kind of into a small private archive. They're not public in the sense of being publicly owned or public institutions. So that would be something interesting to kind of talk about and question the issue of archives being public and how we can, if they should be public, really, that is a question. And the ways in which photographs stop being, family heirlooms and they become public property. So I think that in itself is a question. And regarding video archives, I found no Palestinian video archives. The only videos that I did find were completely colonial, taken by colonial militaries for militaristic reasons. The snaps that you see in the collage, you can say that, I cut these little glimpses, and in a way I kind of dismantled the colonial context, because you take it out of context and then you use the image to serve your own needs. But if you see the reels, the very long reels that I've seen, that you would understand what kind of footage exists. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And sure, Amanda, I'll send you the text. We can talk or email each other after. Mm-hmm.
This is a comment from Sarah. Thank you for your really impactful work. This is more of a comment. There is a really interesting book I think you'd appreciate called No Archives Will Restore You by Juliet Singh. It changed the way I view archives. Question: has this project impacted how you understand identity, and if so, how?
Sorry, I'm gonna have to read it again.
Yeah.
Sorry for this is more of a comment. There is a really interesting book I think you'd appreciate called No Archive Will Restore You. Interesting title by Julieta Singh. It changed the way I view archives. Has this project impacted how you understand your identity? If so, how? Very difficult question. I think I don't have an identity, a political identity that is separate from this project. I think we kind of intertwined together, and the stories that I brought here, and like the footage and the way that it's all put together, is telling of this kind of obsession I have with this thing that is in the past and no one can access. But I think one of the things that I was interested in exploring further was actually how this kind of work, or the information, some of the information that is shown here, can impact the people who live in the city today, because they can see, they can walk in the same streets that I walk in, and I am quite sure that the whole issue of absence is a collective experience. So I was always wondering if this type of historical and fictional information can have an impact whatsoever to the way that people walk in the streets today, and the way that they imagine the past and also know their place in the present. So that is always a question. And I think to that I'll bring one example of, in the second episode, there's excerpts of a story of a boy who's taking the bus to school from Wadi Salib. And the original story is actually taken from the memoirs of Shafiq al-Hut, who was from Jaffa. And the memoirs of Shafiq al-Hut were so inspiring and beautiful that every time after I read them, every time I would pass next to the Hassan Bek mosque in Jaffa, I would see exactly what he described. And I would know exactly where the bus stop that he was describing actually was in the very changed landscape of Jaffa today. And I think that in itself, that little small piece of knowledge was quite not life-changing, but it was something that always stuck with me. So yeah.
Should we see if there's more questions? If not, maybe I can ask you something that hasn't come up yet. So when you guys open the interface, you're going to find that there's a map that can constantly be clicked and opened, and in some ways it accompanies the visual collage. And so what's the story of the map? What importance does it serve in the narrative that you've constructed?
Okay, good question. So the map is actually the way that it was the base of the whole project. I think the more that I read information, it was all kind of like, I always felt really exasperated by my computer screen because it was too small and I couldn't move things around and I couldn't like cross-check things together. And then at some point I started jotting down information according to places. So I built this like really basic Google Maps map, and I started like inserting points on the Google map of whatever I found and who lived there, and kind of putting the information there. And then when I started finding more narratives and more fiction stories about the city, I started jotting down experiences on the map. Of such as the ones in the story of Margarosh, and you know, the different types of experiences that people could have, because a lot of, well, a part of the stories that are brought here were not about Haifa. Some of them, for example, the one about Hamambasha was actually about Damascus, written by Syrian writer Ulfat Idilbi. So it's a beautiful story, and it only also attests to the absence and also the void that is left, because there is no material about Hamambasha, even though it's kind of a landmark in Haifa. So I think the map was really monumental in the way that the stories also started to get their meaning. And also in the places where I felt that there were gaps and there were things that I didn't know enough about, or I couldn't find a story, or I couldn't find a character. So whenever I came across a story that was similar in terms of the epoch, and at least, and the culture, and the value, like the meaning that it was trying to put out, I also started planting these stories inside the map. So that's how basically, yeah, all of the stories that you see hear here are quite manipulated. Yeah.
And here I thought I caught like two moments in which I found like manipulated objects. Turns out it's all a fabrication.
No, not all of it, but yeah.
Tamam. So I think Siham is sharing some amazing resources, including the Brown University Library Research Guide and the Palestinian Museum's Digital Archive project. But we'll like ask if there are any other questions. If not, I think
I'm trying to select the links.
yeah, we'll give people a second to like download what they need from the resources shared.
Yeah, it's really great to have resources shared like this.
Okay.
Um,
Can you share the resources? Faryal, you should be able to see them in the answered questions, I think. Okay. Anyway. Oh, there's more from Adam Haj Yahya. What do you think is the role of speculation and narration in the study of the absent Palestinian city?
Yeah, well, it's a question to explore, because I don't think speculation has been explored enough in its value for Palestinian history. I think because we are denied so much of the facts, and we kind of seek them, that we still don't know the value of the non-historical, or what exceeds or goes beyond the limits of the historical or the historicized. So I think that is something that I think a lot of us are starting to explore, and that I would present the same question to you, to be honest, or to all of you. I do think that in this instance, because I do regard this project as a not a pilot, but it's just an attempt. It's just one way of doing something like this. It's not a final product. It can never be. And I think that speculation here, mostly for me, it brings out the characters. It brings out the characters that we cannot access, because my problem with fiction and autobiographies and written narratives was that they were mostly written by men of a certain class, and also mostly by men who were writing a city after the Nakba, not during, not before. So their perception of the city is very much, it's like us, it's very much influenced by the rupture and the Nakba and the loss of the city. So I always wondered about, how other people who lived in the city, and I think this is also where Mai's comment comes in. I think the access to, I think there's two things. I think there's oral history, which is monumental in our ability to know more, and then to kind of start using speculation in the places where we have no access. And I think in our place today, where much of the information that we seek is lost, or locked up somewhere and cannot be accessed, then speculation kind of becomes the only recourse. But I think it's worth exploring speculation alongside other things as well.
Thank you for that beautiful answer, Adam, for the question. So I think we can close now, but if people are interested in being in touch with Lama in the future, they can definitely email the CPS for her contact information, or just access the Parallax Haifa project online. So Lama, thank you so much. This has been really spectacular. And thank you, CPS and LIFTA, for the opportunity. There is a question from Anas, which I'm tempted to take because Anas is a dear friend. So he's saying, my question is there any other attempt to narrating the story in new technologies and techniques which can help us preserve and present archival material for the public and different generations?
I think, yeah, I think what I was trying to do here is to make accessible information and also non-information. So I think that is a very, very great thing to explore, and there's so many possibilities. And I think a few years ago, when I imagined doing this, I didn't even know the technology exists. And I think we can be really creative. with what technology can afford to us nowadays. So yeah, I think that would be definitely a beautiful thing to explore in collaboration with the work of others. So yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thank you, CPS, Lifta, Simone, Brian, everyone for making this happen. It's been super lovely.
And thank you. And thank you everyone for joining in and asking your questions. It's been really great talking to everyone, and it would be really great to continue discussing things.